The Muggle Death Eater and His Daughter by Great 78. Chapter 29. Clandestine Conversations and Confessions. Early autumn, 1996. Over the next few months, Linda and Narcissa met with Tonks, about once or twice a week. Narcissa kept them apprised of the comings and goings of Lord Voldemort and his disciples, whilst Tonks offered them lessons on self-defence, of both the wizarding and Muggle variety. Linda discussed wizarding healing with them. She had taken numerous medical courses before and during dental school. She knew that she wouldn't be much of a fighter, but if ever there was a fight, it might be helpful to have a medical professional around. Tonks's mother Andromeda worked as a healer, so the younger witch knew a good bit about wizarding healing. Linda had the distinct feeling that Narcissa wanted to ask Tonks to bring Andromeda when they met, but was afraid of being rejected. To explain her whereabouts, Linda told Richard that she had joined a bowling league and a crochet club. In actuality, she had taken up neither of these hobbies, finding that after a long day of digging in people's mouths, her wrists could not handle either activity. Instead, she used these nights as her Charlie's Angels nights, as she had come to refer to them in her head. Richard was annoyed to find that Voldemort summoned them at least one night a week to discuss all manner of mundane, sinister, and sometimes ridiculous things. Therefore, he told Linda that his old friend Robert was getting back into tennis, and wanted to practice doubles, sometimes at the drop of a hat. In actuality, Robert had moved to Edinburgh 3 years ago, but he could have taken up tennis again, Richard reasoned. By tacit understanding, Linda decided not to ask Richard how he was playing tennis with those old beat-up rackets from the cellar, and Richard did not ask to see any of her crocheted mittens. She noticed that he brought up Lucius far more often than before, and he knew that her friendship with Narcissa meant that the two of them spent plenty of time together, not all of it shopping at Tesco. Both of them studiously avoided bringing up Lucius and Narcissa very often, afraid of being questioned for the amount of time they themselves spent in the Malfoys' company. On nights that Linda happened to be away, and the Dark Lord had not summoned Richard, Richard sometimes contacted Lucius. More often than not, Lucius was glad to have an excuse to get away from Malfoy Manor. Their house-guest had long overstayed their welcome, and Lucius heartily wished that all of them would pack up and leave. Richard liked to use these nights to talk through the ideas of blood supremacy and dark magic with Lucius. He was surprised, and more than a little pleased, to learn that the man's views had obviously changed from his youth, when he had first signed on with the Death Eaters. He wasn't sure how much of this change was recent, but in light of their children's relationship, it was welcome, nonetheless. It wasn't all they talked about, of course. Muggle sports and Quidditch also came up frequently, as did the difficulties that Lucius encountered with his newfound role in Voldemort's army. In addition to having to take care of the giants that had been ensconced in Malfoy Forest, Lucius now found himself liaising with goblins and tracking down trolls and yetis. He had no idea when he had become Voldemort's creature person, and he detested it. Richard was full of seemingly helpful suggestions. Maybe the giants are just incredibly bored out there. After all, with only trees and dirt and little animals in the forest, they have nothing to keep them occupied. Richard rubbed his chin thoughtfully. I might have a good solution. Check back in with me next week. The following week, Lucius arrived in the Granger living room to find himself surrounded by an assortment of broken musical instruments. There was a violin with a split back, a guitar with a cracked fretboard, a punctured drum, a rusty saxophone, a harp with broken turning pins, an old trombone with a sticky slide, a pair of bent cymbals, and a warped triangle.
"What is all of this?"
Lucius asked with barely disguised distaste.
"Well, I think it's a solution to your giant problem. I have a patient who runs a music shop. These instruments are not worth his time to repair, so he gave them to me for free. I figured that you could fix them with magic, enlarge them, and give them to your giants,"
Richard finished with an innocent smile. Lucius ignored the use of the possessive words "your giants." Instead, he asked,
"And what would this accomplish, Granger?"
"Well," Richard said, adopting his explaining things to a toddler tone that got under Lucius's skin so well,
"if they have something besides trees and rocks to occupy themselves with, maybe they'll develop a musical interest, maybe learn to work together in harmony. Form a band, perhaps."
Richard congratulated himself for saying all of that with a straight face.
"Well, it can't sound any worse than all of the banging and grunting that comes out of the forest now," Lucius grumbled. "I swear, I have no idea if they're fighting or mating. Maybe it's the same thing in their culture."
He waved his wand and repaired the instruments one by one, then vanished the lot back to Malfoy Manor. When he got home, he enlarged each of them with an engorging charm, and then floated them out to the forest for the giants to find. With any luck, they would be playing Mozart within weeks. Late October 1996. The school year felt surreal to both Draco and Hermione. On the one hand, it had been the most normal start to the year that either of them had experienced. The familiar house rivalries abounded, and each of the Quidditch teams were preparing to do battle. Clubs were meeting without the need for secrecy, now that Umbridge had been ousted. The first Hogsmeade weekend was approaching, and the crisp bite of autumn nipped at everyone's noses. Still, the pall of knowing the task that they had been given hung like a dark cloud over both of them, dampening their enthusiasm for what should have been a fun year as they approached adulthood within the wizarding world.
"I still think that we need to take this problem straight to Dumbledore,"
Hermione said for the upteenth time that year. The two of them were in the library, studying ancient runes together. As the stacks for translations and runes were located far in the back of the library in a remote corner, the two of them were often able to steal away for a Friday night together, doing some semblance of studying between snogging sessions. The first and only time that Theo had invited himself to one of these study sessions, the cool reception he encountered from the two of them was enough to make him pack up and leave early. Now Hermione sat in Draco's lap, straddling him as he trailed soft kisses up her neck.
"Hermione, if we're going to discuss Albus Dumbledore right now, I'm going to need you to get off my lap. You can't possibly expect to discuss a 200-year-old man with me whilst you are rubbing—"
"Merlin, Draco, fine!"
Hermione mock-grumbled, and moved to sit in her own chair. "It's just as well. Pince will be by any moment now. Also, I don't think he's 200 years old, not yet.
Either way, he's not someone I want in my head when I'm snogging my witch."
She chuckled quietly, then sobered. "So, what should we do? We can't actually carry out the act, of course, but if we don't figure out something, he's coming for us, and our parents." She sighed and looked at him with her lovely copper eyes. "I think we need to tell Dumbledore."
Draco sighed. "You're probably right, but to be honest, I'm afraid. Not just of the idea of having to tell him we've been assigned to kill him, but of the disappointment. I realize I'm Lucius Malfoy's son, and that has its own encumbrances, but to have to basically confirm those biases, for people to think that I am a dark wizard—"
"Draco!"
Hermione interrupted him. When he would not look up at her, she reached over and put her hands on his neck, forcing his face up to meet her gaze. His silver eyes were crinkled in worry.
"No one. I repeat, no one will think of you as a dark wizard for having this task assigned to you. Hell, it was assigned to me too, if you haven't remembered."
He shook his head, reaching up to take her hands in his own and hold them on his chest.
"I can't forget that. We dragged you into all this shit. It's my family's fault that you and your father are even part of this."
"We would have been part of it either way,"
Hermione reminded him.
At his quizzical look, she said, "I'm a Muggle-born. If Voldemort were to continue his rise unchecked, my family and I would be targets, whether we were involved in this fight or not."
She paused, then continued,
"Have you ever wondered why I was sorted into Gryffindor and not Ravenclaw?"
Draco smiled. "Well, with how well you've handled all this crazy shite we've gone through, I haven't wondered it lately, but yes, I remember thinking when we were 11 that you were one of the smartest people I knew. I remember thinking when the hat touched your head, you would for sure be a Ravenclaw."
"I know everyone else couldn't hear what the hat said to me, but it did consider Ravenclaw. However, I think it knew that what I really needed to challenge myself was to strengthen my courage. I can read books and understand them. I can recite runes and prime numbers and the properties of 100 different potion ingredients. But to really succeed, I needed to build my resolve, to become more brave."
Draco looked at her as though realizing many new ideas at once.
"I never thought of the hat as trying to figure out what we needed. Always thought it was just reading what was inside of us. I assumed it was all my family's history within me, and that's why I chose Slytherin."
"Yes, Slytherins are cunning and strive for greatness, you're right."
Hermione smirked knowingly at him.
"But they also value resourcefulness, and you've had to become quite resourceful these last few years. Staying one step ahead of your father, winning me over."
It was Draco's turn to laugh quietly.
"Admit it, witch. You're only after me for my looks and my books."
Hermione raised an eyebrow. "Well, neither of them hurt your case." He pulled up one hand of hers and kissed her wrist.
"You might be right. Let's wait until after this upcoming Hogsmeade weekend. That way, if he decides to expel me, we'll at least have one nice weekend together."
She shook her head, but smiled.
"All right. We'll go see him next week."
Early November, 1996.
"The Dark Lord has asked me to track down Yetis, and yet I have no idea where to find them, nor how to trap them once I do."
Lucius was sitting with his feet propped up on an ottoman, enjoying a Newcastle, this one not laced with veritaserum. Between the two men sat a bowl of crisps and a sleeve of biscuits. Richard was amused to find out that Lucius had never tried Oreos, and it turned out they were his new favourite, so Richard always had them around. They put the wizard in a better mood.
"Well, where have you looked?"
asked Richard conversationally. Lucius looked at Richard incredulously.
"All of the usual places," he said snobbishly.
"Well, forgive me. In Muggle parlance, a Yeti is a fictional creature. Where do magical Yetis live?"
Lucius hesitated. I suppose the same place that Muggle Yetis live. Where, exactly, do they reside?"
Richard could tell that Lucius was trying his best to keep his tone light whilst fishing for ideas and answers.
"Well, I know they're rumoured to be in the Himalayas."
"The Himalayas? What are those?"
Geez, I'm always bad at geography. I think it's a mountain range in part of Asia. Tell you what, I can find out for you. Give me a mo."
Richard motioned for Lucius to follow him to an adjoining room, and pressed a button on an odd beige box which began emitting a series of beeps and whirs. Lucius eyed it distrustfully.
"All right, let's see,"
Richard said, sitting down at the desk and tapping on something.
On the uppermost box a series of cryptic shapes appeared that Lucius soon realized were words. "What are you doing?" Lucius asked. Just connecting to Netscape. Only needs a sec." "What exactly is the Netscape?"
"Well, it's sort of like a source of information about all kinds of things. It's like having 24 books, but only about whatever it is you're looking for."
The uppermost glass-fronted rectangle now changed from black with white letters to a small depiction of an hourglass, followed by a picture of a sunlit meadow.
"Is that the Netscape?"
Lucius asked in breathless wonder, reaching out one hesitant finger, intending to push into the meadow and touch the grass, but only finding a smooth glass surface.
"Not quite," Richard said. "Okay, now let me see. Here it is. Just takes a minute to connect. I've got to disconnect the house phone and plug this in. Hold on."
He fiddled with long cords sticking out from the wall. There was another long series of beeps, scratching noises, an ear-piercing whistling coo that sounded like the mating call of the niffler, and then Richard pronounced it ready. He tapped again on the collection of buttons on the tabletop. After a moment, the rectangle at the top of the beige box began to change. Words slowly formed on it, starting at the top and then filling in line by line.
"Wow!"
Lucius exclaimed, unable to help himself.
"I know! It's incredibly fast, isn't it?"
Richard asked excitedly. They read about yetis for several minutes. It turned out that early adopters of the internet had many theories about how to find and trap a yeti. Lots of them involved using fresh meat and a variety of nets. One person had even helpfully uploaded a photograph of a yeti, which Lucius studied intently. To Richard, it looked more like a drunk university student with his mum's fur coat and a Polaroid camera, but he was enjoying Lucius's fascination with the topic nonetheless.
"Ready?"
Hermione asked, putting her hand in Draco's as they stood outside the gargoyle leading to the headmaster's office. Early in the day, Hermione had spoken with Professor McGonagall, and she had in turn relayed the message to Professor Dumbledore that they wished to speak with him. A note had been sent to Hermione requesting that they stop in his office at 8 o'clock that night.
"No," Draco said, "but I doubt I will ever be ready. Let's go."
Somehow, the gargoyle must have alerted Dumbledore to their presence, because it swung aside, revealing a revolving spiral staircase. With one last glance at each other for reassurance, both of them stepped onto the bottom step.
"So, that's what he's asked us to do?"
Hermione finished, after nearly 10 minutes of speaking. Draco had barely anything to add, as Hermione's recollection of the event was so clear. Professor Dumbledore sat at his desk, fingers steepled thoughtfully as he leaned back in his chair. It was hard not to notice the headmaster's blackened hand, though he appeared unperturbed by it.
"Draco, you've been uncommonly quiet during all of this. What are your thoughts?"
Draco jumped at being addressed.
My thoughts are I don't want to do this. I don't want our parents killed. I don't want me and Hermione to be killed, but I have no idea what to do. He seems to think it's simple enough for a 16-year-old to walk into a room and murder someone. Yes, he would think that. He would easily think that, in fact."
Dumbledore nodded thoughtfully, looking over their heads as though recalling something very specific. The two of them waited for him to speak again, and after a long moment, he did.
"I think the 3 of us alone cannot do this correctly. We shall need others,"
Dumbledore finally said, leaning forward and placing his hands flat upon the desk.
"Who were you thinking of?"
Hermione asked breathlessly. Draco took a deep breath to steady himself. The idea of bringing in others on this secret frightened him. It was bad enough that they had had to reveal it to Dumbledore. Who else would have to know? Who else would have the idea planted in their minds that Draco might be a dark wizard? Let me think on it. I will send a note to each of you, and we can meet again next week."
Hermione nodded and rose from her seat, with Draco following suit.
"Thank you, Professor Dumbledore,"
she said warmly, reaching out her right hand instinctively to shake his. Then she seemed to remember his blackened hand and pulled back reflexively, offering her left hand awkwardly after a moment.
"Sir, can we ask you—"
"No, Miss Granger," said the kindly older wizard. "It is a riveting tale that must wait for another day, I'm afraid."
Thank you for listening to this chapter of The Muggle Death Eater by Great 78.